Okay, thank you very much, Laura. Thank you to the Agile Institute for its invitation. It's always a pleasure to be among you when it's possible. So, hello to everyone. I'm not sure I'm actually going to talk about history in the strictest sense, but at least give you an idea of how today, at least almost every facet of government has been changed by technology because it's using technology actually. I suppose an interesting starting point is to distinguish between different things that we can think about when we mention the theme of government and the digital or new technologies. Of course, I would mention four different aspects of that same expression. The first one would be digital in government. So the idea that the state actually uses digital technologies in its internal process. The second part would be digital government services, which is an extremely interesting one, sometimes also called e-government. So the idea that when, as an individual, you expect or you want something from the state, you will have to use some form of digital technology, which asks all kinds of very interesting questions. For instance, does everyone have the resources, the material resources to actually use those digital procedures, for instance? Or even, does everyone has enough knowledge to actually contact the administration through the internet or digital mechanisms? The third one would be digital participation in governance, sometimes also called e-governance. The idea here is to actually use the technology in a positive way, which is to enhance, to favor the public participation in civic life through the digitalization of life. And the last one, which is actually a much broader one, almost infinite one, is the idea of governance in a digital world. In other words, what are the legal, economic, social consequences of digitalization? And what is the role, as we were asked to talk about the role of government, what have governments to do in that regard? Do they have to adopt some form of regulation? In order to make sure, for instance, that certain values or interests are taken into account? Are they supposed to let digital technologies work freely and independently, which is a little bit what's happening so far with, as you know, the internet? There's no real form of regulation. Some people compare it to some kind of, you know, Far West or Clint Eastwood or Sergio Leone movie, which has some truth to it. So the question it actually asks is, do governments have something to do in order to, in a way, regulate what is happening with the new technologies? And what I've just told you about the internet actually also works with social media and all kinds of applications. Is there a role for states there? For instance, in Switzerland, these days, there are a lot of discussions about using clouds. So by public administrations, is it a good idea to resort to private companies to manage public data, so to speak? Is it possible to come up with contracts that actually are able to protect, for instance, personal data that have been stored and collected by the state? And it's a huge topic, even actually in the newspapers. Maybe you've heard that the Swiss Confederation has actually published last year a call for offers for public clouds, so to speak, and it has awarded them only to private companies from other countries, 4 from the United States and 1 from China. And with it come a lot of very tricky questions. For instance, even if you accept that it is possible, for instance, to sign a contract with a private company and that you will be able to put safeguards in the contract that more or less guarantee that it complies with all relevant standards. What do you do with the data? Do you need to keep them in your country? Do you accept that they be delocated to another country? If that is the case, do you need to keep a copy, right? Or can you guarantee access at any time to data that are outside of your country? We used to think, at least I used to think, that borders were more or less disappearing. Now, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that actually borders exist and that states may choose and decide to close them. Now, we saw that in the real world, of course, with family broken apart by borders, but actually borders may also be placed in the digital world. You may imagine a country deciding that it cuts itself off the rest of the world, and then what do you do with your data if you need it, right? So I suppose when we're talking about the use of technology by governments, we should actually at least have in mind the whole picture. It doesn't mean that each of the aspects I've just mentioned carries the same types of risks or the same types of possibilities, by the way. But at least we should be able to remember that it's an actually very broad topic and that you may actually, under the same words, have very different opinions of what you're actually trying to say. Now, if I still have a few minutes left, I think, in my 10 minutes, maybe just to maybe underline another point. I suppose, and I guess that's the realistic way to look at new technologies. New technologies offer new possibilities. It would be foolish to pretend otherwise. But at the same time, they carry new risks. And I suppose for every question, every new use of technology by, for instance, governments, but also private companies, we should actually ask and analyze and ask the questions: what are the good points and what are the bad points? What are the new risks? For instance, and I will finish with a few examples. There is a very strong link between democracy, for instance, and democratic participation and new technologies. To give you another Swiss example, there's been a lot of discussion about e-voting, right? The idea that you can vote from your home, you don't have to go on Sunday. We usually vote 4 times a year in Switzerland. We very often ask to give our opinions, but you see here how this could be a very interesting possibility. People who don't want to go to the polling station on Sunday because they have better things to do. People who don't want to actually, because there's also a possibility of remote voting. So they don't want to actually sign the sheet of paper and actually put a cross here and there. And then you have to put it in an envelope and then you have to bring it to a post office or something like this. Well, people could simply connect on their computer and in a couple of seconds they would have voted. Now you see here, of course, something new, something interesting. But at the same time, of course, a lot of questions. For instance, about security. How do you make sure it's actually the real person who's voting or not someone else taking her or his name? When I was mentioning democratic participation, of course, it's much broader than that. Because as you know, as the European Court of Human Rights is used to say, democratic participation requires public conversation. And of course, today, a lot of those conversations happen online. And from a certain point of view, of course, it's a very good thing because you may have information that get transmitted online that could never otherwise in the old world of paper have been actually transmitted. But at the same time, of course, you have all the risks that go with the social media, the use of algorithm, etc., the risk of echo chambers. So that's Another, and of course, the whole scourge of hate speech online. But at the same, it's the same technology, right? That brings these new possibilities, reinforced democratic participation, or forms of protestation, for instance, in dictatorships. But it's the same technology that allows all the bad aspects that I've just mentioned. Of course, the second risk I just wanted to point out is the risk of what happens to information, and in particular data, and in particular personal data, right? Sensible data. What happened to it? There's a colleague, Solange Gernauti in Lausanne, whose thesis is, as soon as you put something on your computer, you accept that it may be actually accessed by someone unauthorized. And her example, of course, are the NSA cables that have been published. And her argument, which I find quite convincing, is to say, if the NSA is not in a position to protect its data, then you and I won't be either. So that's another problem, right? The question of data protection. And finally, let me finish by saying that under some aspects, what was possible before is actually still being done by governments, but in a new way, in a digital way. And from that point of view, I suppose we should be able to use our old ideas about what should be done. But there are some instances in which technologies actually allow different things that were not possible before. And the main example of that is mass surveillance. Mass surveillance used not to be possible because you didn't have, I mean, no one had the technological possibilities to actually monitor everyone in a given country. Now it's possible using keywords, using algorithms, using computers. You may be able to, yes, Laura, thank you. You may be able to actually filter every email that is being sent at every given second on your territory. And that's a new challenge, because here technology is not simply a new way. It's not just old wine in new bottles, it's actually new wine. And for instance, from a human rights point of view, of course, it triggers new interrogations and new questions that should be dealt with. Right, my time is up. Thank you for your attention. And I give back the floor to our host.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Laura, and thank you, Frederic Bernard, for your great insight. If we think a bit about technology and history in Geneva and how did we end up here, just maybe bounce back on the idea of new technology, and the telegraph, for instance, was the first international organization in Geneva. And there is a huge debate in history whether or not that maybe triggered First World War, because before there was a lot of diplomacy, and after the beginning of the telegraph, it was hard for diplomats to intervene because chief of state could communicate between themselves without any filter. So it was maybe a key moment. And if I start maybe at the beginning of the First World War, because we don't need to get into long time history and all the nitty-gritty of funny anecdote in Geneva, maybe just to mention one, there was a tsunami in the Lac Léman in the 6th century, because the mountain in Valais fell into the lake. So yeah, there is a lot of funny anecdotes. But to continue on the maybe the First World War, as you know, in 1898 there was the assassination of Sissi, the Imperatrice, in Geneva. So for the emperor of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, it was maybe also he mourned and he grieved a lot his young wife who died in Geneva. It may be also a trigger also the First World War. So it's also interesting to see see Geneva in the bigger history. There was a lot of debates between Geneva, La Haye, Brussels, or other city to choose which city will host the League of Nations, so the ancestor of the League of Nations. It was chosen because Geneva Switzerland was neutral after the Pact of Vienna in 1815. It was also good for the other country of the region that Switzerland was neutral, because for France, it was good to have this kind of shield protecting from Austria. So Geneva, a lot of European countries had an interest in Switzerland being neutral. Then there is the whole question of neutrality. Was Switzerland really neutral, for example, during the World War II? And maybe you heard about the rapport Berger, if Switzerland financed the Allied, but also Nazi, 1 billion for the Nazis. So there is a lot of debate about the role of Switzerland in World War II. Geneva was bombed once by the British because they thought it was Geneva in Italy, and Genova and Geneva have the same etymology. In Celtic, it means a place near water. It was first mentioned by Julius Caesar. So Geneva has a long history, or maybe it wasn't because it was Geneva. They thought maybe there was a train that they could be bombed. So of course there is all kind of debate. Maybe just to wrap up on the two World War, because I know you are also interested in migration. During the First World War, there was almost no migration in Switzerland. Before, in 19th century, it was easy to enter Switzerland, no need to passport. The first passport was in 1915. You can see Charlie Chaplin in a movie complaining about the introduction of passport. Charlie Chaplin lived 25 years in Geneva. There is a great museum if you want to check. I'm sorry if I roam in every direction, but it's kind of history alike, maybe not chronological, but more related to topic. So before 1915 in Switzerland, there was no really, you were a foreigner if you were from Valais or another canton, because there was no passport. So even though the constitution is 1848, we have to wait until 1915 and the First World War to have the introduction of passport. And now, of course, we all take passport for granted. It's also something interesting to reflect on technology. So when it's implemented, or it's difficult to reflect back. We just take it for granted. Now there is no contestation for passport. It's more about biometric passport. But passport, people are not advocating for like in 1915. By the way, the first mention of the world activism, it's 1912. So it starts roughly at the same moment, the time of institutionalization and internationalism. Then also we can reflect why Geneva and not La Haye and not Brussels. Maybe it's related to Protestantism, because Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States at this moment, was Protestant, came from a Protestant family, so he liked the idea also of Geneva. So it's interesting also to see how micro-history, so really personal history of someone, can relate to bigger history. Of course, it wasn't only Woodrow Wilson. There was a lot of connection between university, and one of the person who really wanted Geneva as the head of international organization went in Harvard and Princeton. So there was a lot of connection with the US at that time. So yeah, many reasons why we end up here with the international organization in Geneva. I know you have an interest with migration too. We can discuss maybe more in group on the long history of migration. So after World War I and World War II, there was a wave of migration, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese. We can discuss it more together, because I don't want to run out of time. We can discuss also maybe on the history of neutrality, if you think ethically Switzerland was really neutral, or maybe how do you think this neutrality concept should be enforced, or is it useful at all? Or maybe you think Geneva has never been neutral. We can talk maybe about some cliche or stereotype about Geneva, the history of watchmaking, of banking. It may be also tied to the reform, so this idea of Protestant Roma. And maybe to just finish, we can discuss a bit about the debate now on historicization. The government of Geneva want to rename streets or removing statues. For instance, renaming the Karl Vogt campus, named after a racist scientist. Of course, he was not only a racist scientist, he was also suffragist, pro-democracy. He discussed with Bakunin, Karl Marx, but definitely he had the racist theory. So they want to change the name. We can discuss about this. I think it's a great time to be an historian or aspiring historian, because we discuss a lot about history nowadays and the link with technology. And maybe just to finish, when we think about the downside side of new technology. Of course, Geneva was had a huge printing industry after the reform. And when you think about the invention of the birth of scripture, just to go back in history, Plato was complaining about it. He said, now people with scripture, people do not memorize text anymore. People do not talk with long phrases. So it's funny to think like even something as banal as scripture was granted with pushbacks when they were first implemented. That's it for me. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion.